The winter morning rose in silence, a pale and colorless light spreading across the snow-covered hollow, where the pines stood motionless beneath their heavy burden of frost. The air was so cold it seemed to ring, sharp and metallic, and the sky hung low and gray, flattening the world under its quiet weight. Through this landscape moved a wolverine, alone, steady, and unhurried. Its fur was thick and coarse, dark along the spine with paler streaks along the flanks, and old scars traced thin ridges beneath the hair, signs of battles won through endurance rather than strength alone. Hunger pressed against its ribs, not violently but with a dull and persistent tug, reminding it that winter demanded constant tribute. The wolverine paused, lifted its muzzle, and drew in the scents carried on the wind, resin from the pines, the cold dampness of a frozen stream buried under layers of ice and snow, old moose tracks half hidden by the previous night's snowfall, and far off, faint but clear enough to stir attention, the scent of a fox that had fed recently. A fox rarely left scraps unless the meal had been large. Where the fox had eaten, there might be remains. The wolverine moved with a patient determination, its paws sinking deep, but its steps efficient, each motion conserving energy. Above, ravens watched from the high branches, their feathers shining like stones polished by river water. One croaked, then another answered, the forest acknowledging the wolverine's passage. The hollow knew every creature that crossed it. To the south of this quiet valley, a cabin stood beside the frozen river, thin smoke trailing from its crooked chimney. Inside, a man named Ilya Moroz sorted through steel traps laid out across a rough-hewn table. His hands were thick and scarred, his face worn by cold wind and years of silent work. Outside, his daughter Katya chopped wood, bundled in a fur-lined hat that sat low over her brow. She paused, letting the axe rest, her breath rising in pale clouds as she listened to the distant calls of ravens. She had grown up in this forest and understood that the birds' voices were never random. Something was moving in the hollow, something the forest considered important. Inside, Ilya prepared to take the sled toward the timberline, where traps would be set not for sport, but for the fur that bought flour, salt, and lamp oil, the things that allowed humans to survive winter, as the animals did. Rumor had reached him of a large wolverine roaming these woods, bold enough to drive wolves from a carcass, strong enough to drag a deer's leg through deep snow. To some trappers, that meant profit, to others, trouble. Katya had heard the stories and felt neither fear nor excitement, only a steady awareness. Animals were not demons. They lived by the same laws of hunger and caution as all things in the valley. The wolverine reached a clearing where the snow had been disturbed, scattered with delicate bones and the faint red stain of a meal already taken. The ribs of a winter-thin deer lay half exposed, scraped nearly clean, but there was still marrow deep inside, calories worth fighting for. The wolverine lowered its head and began to gnaw, cracking small bones with deliberate pressure. A soft crunch sounded behind it, and the wolverine turned sharply, muscles coiled. But it was only a raven, hopping closer in bold expectation. The wolverine growled, low and short. The raven fluttered back a step but did not leave. In this frozen world, hunger was a shared language, and the forest rarely allowed waste. Yet unseen in the trees were other intentions. Iron jaws carried on a sled, human judgment shaped by necessity, and the fine line between coexistence and conflict. The wolverine fed, the birds watched, the snow recorded every step. The pines guarded the hollow, and winter, quiet and relentless, was only beginning to tell its story. As the pale day deepened toward its short winter noon, the wolverine left the picked clean remains and moved deeper into the hollow, its gait steady and unhurried. The cold was a constant companion, but not an enemy. The heavy fur coat trapped heat close to its skin, and the animal's muscles generated warmth through movement. Hunger had eased for now, though not fully. In winter, hunger never truly left. The snow stretched ahead in soft drifts, shaped by wind, each one marked by the quiet tracks of those who came before. A hare's bounding leaps, a marten's weaving line, the wide, straight trail of a deer that had passed during the night. The wolverine read each sign as one reads the slow pages of a book, understanding which tracks were fresh, which were fading stories already closed. The forest around was dense with old trees, their trunks thick and rough, bark coated in ice, where snowmelt had frozen during the last brief thaw. The canopy blocked much of the wind, but occasionally a gust rattled through the needles and sent a thin shower of frost drifting downward. The Wolverine stopped when a faint crack of wood reached its ears. It lowered its body and listened. Snow could break under many weights, but this sound was too sharp, too sudden. Something heavier than a fox, lighter than a moose. It moved slowly toward the sound, careful and quiet. Wolverines were not hunters of speed. They were hunters of patience. The animal crept along a fallen log, its paws finding silent purchase on bark hidden beneath snow. A clearing opened beyond the trees, and there, just at its edge, stood a young deer, thin-hipped and hollow-flanked, nibbling at a patch of dried leaves uncovered by wind. Its ribs were visible, pressing through the fur like pale bars. Winter had begun to claim its strength. The deer lifted its head suddenly. It did not see the Wolverine, but some instinct born from generations of survival sent it bounding away into the deeper forest, snow scattering behind in pale arcs. The Wolverine did not chase. Such a pursuit would waste strength. It watched until the deer's sound faded, then turned away and continued along its unknown path. The forest was not a place of dramatic battles every day. It was a place of constant calculation. Energy spent versus energy gained. The Wolverine understood this perfectly, for its life depended on that knowledge. Far away, beyond the rise of the hill and along the frozen riverbank, Ilya Moroz guided his sled through the trees. The runners hissed softly over the packed snow, and the horse, a small, thick-coated gelding, steamed in the cold air. Katya walked beside the sled, her boots sinking slightly with each step. The forest surrounded them in immense quiet. It was not an empty quiet, but a listening one, as though the trees themselves leaned inward to hear what passed between man and winter. Ilya set traps with practiced efficiency, driving stakes into the snow-packed ground, adjusting the pressure on the spring mechanisms, covering each carefully beneath twigs and powder. Katya watched, her breath forming clouds that dissolved almost instantly. She had helped him for years, yet she always felt a weight settle in her chest when the iron jaws clicked into place. Traps did not kill instantly, and no matter what her father said, she knew that pain was real, whether or not the forest spoke of it. "These woods don't give gifts," Ilya said quietly, as though sensing her thoughts. "Everything here costs something. Meat, fur, wood, fire, breath. You take one thing to keep another." Katya nodded. She understood, but did not like to. Her gaze drifted toward the dark tree line. She felt watched, not with malice, but with awareness, as if the forest itself took note of their presence, weighing their purpose. Somewhere beyond those trees, the Wolverine moved, distant yet near, the two paths slowly beginning to bend toward one another. The day dimmed. The sun had not truly risen, yet it already began to fall, sinking behind the mountains like a coin dropped into deep water. The shadows lengthened. Cold thickened. The Wolverine found shelter beneath a windfall, a cluster of uprooted roots and tangled branches, forming a natural cave where dry leaves and old earth lay protected from the snow. It curled inside, breath slow and steady, eyes half closed but always aware. The forest settled into its evening hush, the kind that seemed to stretch into eternity. But somewhere far above, ravens began to gather on the high branches, black silhouettes against the bruised gray sky. They spoke in quiet croaks and soft, rattling calls, their voices carrying meaning like thread through cloth. Something was shifting, something moving. The hollow, the trees, the creatures, they were all listening to the same unfolding story. The Wolverine, the trapper, the child, the cold, the hunger, the necessity, paths were being drawn together as surely as the river carved its course beneath the ice. And the night arrived with its deep blue silence, holding the fate of all within its stillness. Night folded over the hollow like a heavy woolen blanket, thick and soundless. The wind quieted, the pines stood unmoving, and the snow reflected the faint, cold light of the hidden moon. Under the fallen tangle of tree roots, the Wolverine rested, though rest for such a creature was never complete. Its ears twitched at distant sounds. Its nose tested the shifting currents of scent that whispered through the forest floor. Hunger was eased, but not gone. The marrow of the deer ribs had not been enough for long. When the first pale wash of dawn returned, the wolverine rose and shook frost from its fur. The world around it was frozen and unchanging, but the forest was never still. Something had moved through the night. A different scent lingered in the air. Sharp metal, cold oil, and the faint trace of human hands. The wolverine, without understanding the reason, understood the meaning. Something foreign had been placed in its territory. Something dangerous. It began to follow the scent trail, moving with that same steady patience that defined all of its choices, paws pressing deep impressions into the snow. The smell of humans grew stronger near a narrow stream that lay frozen beneath a thick shell of ice, its surface smooth and without cracks. There, half buried beneath a scatter of twigs and a layer of fine snow, something glinted. A trap. Iron jaws disguised beneath a deceptive calm. The wolverine approached, keeping low. Its keen sense of smell told it everything it needed to know. The trap was fresh. The trail of human steps led toward the hill, then back toward the river, returning to the cabin miles away. The wolverine did not step closer. Animals learned differently than humans. Curiosity for them was always weighed against cost. It circled the trap once, twice, the slow arc of its prints forming a wreath of warning in the snow. Then it moved on. Far away, Katya and Ilya crossed the frozen river, now hardened enough to bear weight. The horse moved cautiously, each step tapping the surface before committing its weight. The ice groaned occasionally beneath them, an old sound like deep wood bending. Katya walked with hands tucked deep into her coat sleeves, her breath coming slow in the cold air. She had slept poorly. The forest had felt restless in the night, as though something unseen paced the darkness. "We'll check the traps near the upper ridge today," Ilya said, his voice steady, shaped by years of necessity rather than choice. Katya nodded but did not speak. The snow muffled all sound except the creak of harness leather and the whisper of skis sliding behind the sled. They reached the foot of the ridge, where the slope rose under tall trees. The traps lay spaced along the line of game trails, hidden carefully. Ilya knelt to inspect the first. Empty. The second. Empty. The third. Still empty. Katya felt something tighten in the silence between them. Ilya's jaw hardened slightly. Traps brought food. Food brought survival. A winter without luck was a winter that scraped dangerously close to hunger. The wolverine, meanwhile, had found another trap not far from the ridge, placed near the hollow of a birch tree where small animals often sheltered. The scent of bait lingered faintly, dried fish soaked in animal fat. A clever lure, but the wolverine had seen fish, and it had seen death, and it understood the difference. The forest had taught it well. It moved past without hesitation. But there, in the snow beside the trap, lay something that held its attention longer. Fresh tracks, not the trapper's heavy boots. Lighter, smaller, a human child's steps. The wolverine lowered its head, studying the pattern. It did not know what a child was, but it recognized that there were different kinds of humans. Some loud, some quiet, some dangerous, some simply present. The tracks led away back toward the river. The wolverine sat for a moment in the stillness, listening to the far-off calls of ravens that gathered near the treetops. They spoke of change, of movement, of story. The wolverine rose again and moved deeper into the woods. By midday, the sun flickered weakly through the branches, painting pale streaks of light across the snow. Katya stopped when she noticed something odd in the untouched white. Tracks, not deer, not fox. She knelt, studying them carefully, her breath catching slightly. Wolverines were rare to see, rarer still to track. But these prints were fresh, very fresh. "Papa," she said quietly. Ilya came and crouched beside her. His eyes narrowed. The size of the tracks, their spacing, the depth of each impression, all told him the same thing. It's close, he murmured. Katya felt something shift inside her. Not fear, not excitement, but the quiet awareness of crossing a boundary. The Wolverine was no story now. It was here, moving the same forest paths, breathing the same winter air, thinking, choosing, surviving. The trapper and his daughter stood on one thread of the story. The Wolverine stood on another, and the forest itself held both threads together, tightening them slowly, steadily, as winter deepened around them. The cold deepened over the next 2 days, the temperature sinking lower than the river stones beneath the ice. The forest seemed to shrink inward under the pressure of frost, each branch stiff and brittle, each breath from the living creatures turning to pale vapor that hung in the air before fading into nothing. The Wolverine moved through this hardened world with the same steady endurance it had always known. Winter was not an adversary to be defeated. It was a condition of existence. Hunger, cold, distance, effort. These things shaped life into what it was meant to be. The Wolverine followed the ridge now, drawn not by any conscious plan, but by the slow and constant call of instinct. Beneath the snow, its paws pressed into old frozen pine needles and soil, hardened into rock-like firmness. The forest was quiet today. The ravens did not call. The wind was weak. The only sounds were the slow rhythm of movement and the occasional soft cracking of the snow crust under weight. Then, carried faintly on the still air, came another sound, something struggling. A sharp rustle, followed by a low, pained groan. The Wolverine halted. It lifted its head and sniffed. The smell was familiar. Fur, fear sweat, the sharp tang of blood, and the cold, metallic scent of iron. A trap had been triggered. The Wolverine approached, but not recklessly. It moved through the trees, paws silent on the snow, body low to the ground. And there, in a shallow hollow beneath a fallen spruce, was a fox, its front paw crushed tight between the steel jaws of a trap. The fox's fur was thick with winter fullness, its tail plush, its muzzle narrow and trembling. Its breath came fast, its eyes glassy with pain and fury and fear, fixed on the Wolverine. They were not enemies. They were not allies. They were simply two lives intersecting in the relentless mathematics of winter. The Wolverine studied the fox. There was plenty of meat here, enough to satisfy hunger for the day, perhaps longer. But the Wolverine did not move forward. Something in its memory, years of forest lessons, told it that this situation was not natural. The fox was not dying by nature's law. It was dying by human design. And where traps were set, humans came back. The Wolverine stepped back into the trees and moved away. It did not pity. It did not judge. It simply chose survival. That was all any creature could do. Hours later, Ilya and Katya came upon the same hollow. The fox lay silent now. Ilya knelt beside it, expression unreadable. The animal had died recently. The warmth had not fully left the body. A clean pelt, he said quietly. Katya stared at the fox's face and felt a small tightening in her chest. She knew the trap had done its work as intended. She knew this was how the forest answered hunger. But something about the stillness of the animal's eyes unsettled her. It looked as though the fox had not died alone, as if something else had been here. She scanned the snow. The tracks were there, clear and deliberate, deep prints, widely spaced. The Wolverine had stood here, had watched, had left. Katya crouched and placed her hand over the print, her glove dwarfed by its size. It was here, she murmured. Ilya said nothing at first. He studied the way the tracks circled the trap, the way they turned away. It knew, he said finally. Not in words of magic or mystery, but in the plain voice of a man who had lived a long time in winter. It has seen traps before. It has learned. Katya lifted her gaze to the forest. The trees watched. The air held its breath. Something about this animal felt different. Not larger, not stronger, but older in experience, shaped by hardship. We should leave this place, she said quietly. Ilya did not disagree. They tied the fox to the sled and began the slow journey back down the ridge. But the awareness did not leave them. The Wolverine was not merely surviving alongside them. It was moving within the same territory, crossing the same corridors of trees, following the same invisible pathways of hunger and necessity. The forest was not large enough to prevent their lives from touching. Somewhere deeper in the pines, the Wolverine stopped and watched the distant movement of the sled through the trees. Its eyes were calm. It did not see enemies. It did not see friends. It only saw beings who took the same things it took from the forest. Beings who understood hunger. The air between them was not peace, and it was not conflict. It was simply the quiet before either could become true. Snow fell through the night, slow and steady, layering the hollow and soft white that muffled every sound. By morning, the forest seemed remade, the familiar paths hidden beneath new drifts. The branches bowed low under the weight of silence. Ilya rose early, moving with the practiced rhythm of a man who had weathered many winters. Katya dressed in heavy wool and stepped outside, where the cold pressed against her cheeks like solid glass. The world around the cabin was still, untouched, except for one line of tracks leading from the riverbank to the tree line. They were too large for fox, too steady for dog, and too single-minded to be deer. The Wolverine had passed during the night. Katya knelt and pressed her glove to the snow. The tracks were fresh, sharp-edged. The Wolverine had not wandered. It had walked with purpose, as though following some invisible thread. She rose slowly, her breath trailing out in pale clouds, and looked toward the forest with a thought she could not name. Ilya joined her, his expression unreadable. He studied the tracks, then the trees, then the silent sky. "It is bold," he said simply. The forest seemed to listen. Meanwhile, deeper among the pines, the Wolverine moved along a narrow ravine where the wind could not reach. The snow here was softer, the scent of shelter stronger. Ahead, a dark shape lay in the snow, still, half covered. The Wolverine approached cautiously. A deer, thin and frost-stiffened, had collapsed here sometime before dawn. Whether it died from hunger, exhaustion, or cold no longer mattered. In winter, the difference was irrelevant. Death was simply the continuation of the forest's cycle. The Wolverine lowered its head and began to feed, tearing into the meat slowly and deliberately. Nothing wasted. Ravens gathered, perching in the branches overhead, their black feathers stark against the white world. They waited. The Wolverine did not chase them away. It simply ate until its hunger eased and the sharpness of need softened into quiet strength. Only then did it step back, leaving enough for the ravens and whatever else the forest might send to this place. The pines swallowed the Wolverine once more as it moved on, belly full, breath warm, muscles steady. It traveled along the edge of the ridge and down toward the frozen river, drawn again not by hunger but by some unseen pull of territory, of pattern, of paths crossed before. Katya and Ilya took the sled out again that afternoon. The sky had cleared, leaving the world washed in a white glare that made the air itself seem bright. Their breath hung like smoke as they followed the familiar trail toward the upper hollow. The horse moved slowly, careful not to break through the snow crust. Near the river bend, Katya saw them first, prints large and distinct, cutting across the trail they were following. She crouched to study them, her heart beating with slow awareness. The Wolverine had passed very recently. Ilya stopped the sled. For a moment, neither spoke. The forest around them did not feel threatening, yet it felt full in a way that made speech unnecessary. There was presence here. The Wolverine had crossed the same ground. Close. Very close. The horse flicked its ears, uneasy. Ilya's hand rested on its reins, but his gaze drifted toward the tree line. He did not fear the Wolverine. A Wolverine rarely attacked humans, and this one had no reason to. But he understood something else. The forest had begun to tighten its circle. The paths of man and animal were no longer simply parallel. They were touching, overlapping. Katya stood slowly, brushing snow from her knees. She did not look anxious. She looked thoughtful. "It's not avoiding us," she said softly. Ilya nodded. He knew this too. "No," he said. "It knows where we are, and it chooses where it goes. The sled moved on, their tracks joining the layered stories written in the snow. The ravens followed now, drifting overhead like dark thoughts. The wind began to rise, stirring the pines, and somewhere unseen, the Wolverine paused, listening to the distant creak of the sled's runners, the soft jingle of harness metal. It knew they were near, but it felt no need to flee. The forest held enough space for both, for now, yet winter had grown sharper. Hunger could return, traps could close. A mistake on either side could break the delicate silence. The hollow watched. The pines guarded their traveler, and the story continued to draw the lives of human and animal closer, as inevitably as snow follows cold.